a house drowned in silence, two children who forgot how to smile, and a strange woman who, with a single phrase, changes everything without knowing what she would awaken. The clock struck exactly 6 in the morning when Edward Baker opened his eyes. He didn't need an alarm. His body had grown accustomed to the impeccable routine he had imposed upon himself. He rose with calculated movements, straightened the sheets of his king-size bed, which he had occupied alone for almost 3 years, and walked to the window to open the curtains. Outside, Portland was awakening under a fine drizzle, typical of Oregon's fall. The mansion in the West Hills neighborhood, one of the most prestigious in the city, had 3 floors and an architecture that blended classical elements with contemporary touches, a project he had personally supervised while building not just the house, but also his empire. Baker Construction was now one of the largest companies in the Pacific Northwest, responsible for developments that had transformed the skyline of several cities. Edward headed to the bathroom and faced his reflection. 45 years old, prematurely graying hair at the temples, attentive brown eyes, erect posture. He put on his robe and checked the clock again. At 6:15, as he did every day, he went to his twin daughter's bedroom. Isabella and Lucy, 9 years old, slept in separate beds in a spacious room decorated in light blue tones, a color Edward had chosen after reading a study about environments that stimulated concentration and tranquility. The girls were physically identical: long brown hair, small upturned noses, and subtle freckles on their cheeks. But to Edward, who observed them daily with disciplined attention, the differences were evident. Isabella always slept on her back, organized even in sleep. Lucy wrapped herself in the sheets, frequently hugging her pillow. 6:15, girls, time to wake up, he announced in a firm voice, without raising his tone. The twins opened their eyes almost simultaneously. There was no laziness or resistance. Like their father, they had learned to obey the clock. "Good morning, Dad," they responded in unison, sitting up in their beds. The usual routine: shower, uniform, breakfast at 6:45. "You have a math test today, be prepared." Edward didn't wait for a response. He turned and left while the girls began their morning routine with the silent efficiency they had developed. There were no good morning kisses, hugs, or any physical display of affection. In the Baker household, affection had been replaced by efficiency. In the spacious and immaculate kitchen, Rita, the cook who had worked for the family for more than 10 years, was already preparing breakfast: scrambled eggs with spinach, whole wheat toast, freshly squeezed orange juice, and a portion of carefully cut fruit. Edward liked precision in nutrition as well: proteins, carbohydrates, and vitamins in exact proportions. While waiting for his daughters, Edward opened his tablet and checked the day's news and emails from his construction company. His mind was already working on the meetings he would have, contracts to be signed, decisions that needed to be made. Work was his refuge, the only place where he felt completely in control. At precisely 6:45, Isabella and Lucy entered the kitchen, dressed in identical uniforms from Palmer Academy, the most prestigious school in Portland. They sat in their usual places, one on each side of their father. "Good morning, Rita," they said politely. "Good morning, my little flowers," replied the cook, with an affectionate smile rarely seen in that house. Breakfast proceeded in silence, broken only by the clinking of silverware on plates and brief instructions from Edward about the day. There were no conversations about dreams, plans, or feelings. Words served only practical purposes, like tools in a well-organized box. "Mrs. Judith won't be coming today," Edward announced between sips of coffee. "She had a health issue and will be away for a few weeks." The girls looked at their father with an expression difficult to decipher. Mrs. Judith was the housekeeper who had cared for them since they were born. She was the one who organized the house with military rigor, following Edward's instructions to the letter. She was also the only person, besides Rita, who had remained after what everyone in the house referred to only as the incident. "Is she okay, Dad?" asked Lucy, the more sensitive of the two. "She'll be fine. Heart problems, nothing serious. She herself recommended a temporary replacement who will arrive this afternoon. I've called Mercedes to take you to school today." Mercedes was the family driver, a serious and professional woman who rarely spoke more than necessary, exactly how Edward preferred it. At 7:15, the girls were already in the car, backpacks over their shoulders, hair perfectly combed. Edward watched them through the window of his office as the vehicle left the property. He allowed himself an almost imperceptible sigh. Everything was under control, as it should be. Edward's workday invariably began at 8 o'clock, when his personal driver took him to the imposing Baker Construction Building in Portland's business center. But today, exceptionally, he had decided to work from home in the morning. He needed to be present when the new housekeeper arrived. At 10 o'clock, while reviewing projects in his office, the intercom rang. It was the security guard announcing the arrival of Sarah Oliveira. "You can let her in," Edward authorized. 5 minutes later, his virtual assistant announced that the visitor was waiting in the living room. Edward took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and descended the stairs with measured steps. He detested changes in his routine, but Mrs. Judith had assured him that Sarah was reliable and, more importantly, discreet. The woman waiting for him was nothing like he had imagined. He had expected someone with Mrs. Judith's profile, practical, efficient, middle-aged, and with a severe appearance. Instead, he found a lady of about 60, short, with brown skin marked by time, grey hair pulled back in a simple bun, and surprisingly lively and perceptive brown eyes. She was dressed simply, a navy blue skirt, a white blouse, and a beige wool cardigan. She carried a small handbag and observed the environment with genuine interest. "Mr. Baker, I presume," she said in a calm, melodious voice that carried the typical accent of rural Oregon. "I'm Sarah Oliveira. Mrs. Judith spoke very highly of you and the girls." Edward noticed that she didn't extend her hand to greet him, as if she intuited that he didn't appreciate unnecessary physical contact. "Welcome, Mrs. Oliveira. I hope Mrs. Judith explained how things work around here." "You can call me Mrs. Sarah, as everyone does," she smiled slightly. "And yes, Judith explained everything. I'm a woman of routines too, Mr. Baker. I have experience taking care of houses and families for more than 40 years. Edward nodded, satisfied with the direct response. "Excellent. I'll show you the house and explain your responsibilities. The girls arrive from school at 1 o'clock. They eat lunch and then have extra classes. Piano on Mondays and Wednesdays, ballet on Tuesdays and Thursdays, academic tutoring on Fridays. On weekends, they study in the morning and have scheduled activities in the afternoon. Everything is detailed in this folder." He handed her a meticulously organized binder with schedules, contacts, instructions, and even maps of the house and neighborhood. "Impressive," commented Mrs. Sarah, leafing through the material. "You think of everything." There was something in her tone that Edward couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't irony. Perhaps it was understanding. He dismissed the thought and continued, "You'll have the bedroom next to the girls with your own bathroom. Day off on Sundays unless there's a special need. Any questions?" Mrs. Sarah closed the folder and looked directly into Edward's eyes, with an intensity that made him feel momentarily uncomfortable. "Just one, Mr. Baker. How are the girls' hearts?" The question caught Edward by surprise. No one, since the incident, had dared to ask him such a direct question about his daughter's emotional state. "They're fine," he replied dryly, "adapted to the routine. They have excellent grades in school and are healthy." Mrs. Sarah continued to stare at him for a few seconds, as if expecting more. Then she nodded slightly. "I understand. Well, I'm eager to meet them. If you'll show me my room, I'd like to get settled before they arrive." As he led her through the house, Edward felt an inexplicable discomfort. There was something about this simple woman that seemed to see beyond the meticulously painted walls, beyond the perfectly timed routines, beyond the restrained smiles and measured words that constituted the fortress he had built around his family. And that deeply disturbed him. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The girls arrived from school at exactly 1 o'clock, as expected. Mercedes, the driver, parked the car at the entrance of the mansion and helped the twins with their backpacks. Edward, who was watching the movement from his office window, observed how Isabella got out first, always practical and direct, while Lucy lingered a few seconds more, looking at the cloudy sky as if searching for something in the clouds. He went downstairs to receive them, finding them in the entrance hall where they were already taking off their coats and hanging them on the designated hooks for each one. "How was the test?" he asked, getting straight to the point. "I got all the questions right, Dad," replied Isabella with the certainty of someone who had checked each answer 3 times before turning it in. "I think I missed one," admitted Lucy, biting her lower lip. The last question was about fractions, and I mixed up the denominator. Edward nodded, showing neither disappointment nor approval. We'll study that this weekend. Come, I want to introduce you to someone. He led his daughters to the living room where Mrs. Sarah was waiting for them. The housekeeper was sitting in an armchair, her hands calmly resting on her lap. When she saw the girls, her eyes lit up in a way that Edward found almost excessive. Isabella, Lucy, this is Mrs. Sarah. She'll be replacing Mrs. Judith while she recovers. The twins, polite as always, made a small bow with their heads. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sarah, said Isabella, formal. Welcome to our home, added Lucy. Mrs. Sarah stood up and, to Edward's surprise, approached the girls and held the hand of each one. A gesture he would consider invasive under normal circumstances, but which happened so naturally that he didn't have time to intervene. The pleasure is all mine, dears. You're even more beautiful than I was told. Edward noticed something strange in the comment. Who could have talked to her about the girl's appearance? Mrs. Judith was extremely reserved, but before he could reflect on this, Rita announced that lunch was served. During the meal, Edward observed with growing discomfort how Mrs. Sarah interacted with his daughters. Unlike Mrs. Judith, who maintained a respectful distance and spoke only when necessary, Sarah asked questions, smiled frequently, and more disturbingly managed to extract responses from the girls that went beyond monosyllables. "And what do you like most about studying, Isabella?" she asked as they were serving dessert, a peach compote that Rita had prepared with fruit from the property's orchard. "Mathematics," replied the girl, and after a brief pause added, "and history, when we study ancient civilizations." Edward raised his eyebrows. He didn't know about his daughter's interest in ancient history. "And you, Lucy?" The quieter twin hesitated for a moment, looking quickly at her father as if seeking approval to respond. "I like literature. We're reading fables in school, and then we write our own stories." "Ah, a writer!" exclaimed Mrs. Sarah with enthusiasm. "You must have quite an imagination. Has your father read any of your stories?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Edward felt a knot form in his throat. Lucy was writing stories. Since when? Why didn't he know about this? "The girls have piano in half an hour," he said, checking his watch. "They need to prepare." Lunch ended on that abrupt note. Edward returned to his office, but couldn't concentrate on the projects he needed to review. His mind kept returning to the subtle revelations of lunch. There were details about his own daughters that he was unaware of. How was that possible? At 4 o'clock, when the girls finished their piano lesson, Edward called them for their afternoon snack, another timed and balanced meal. He noticed that both seemed more animated than usual, and Lucy even smiled when she saw the carrot cake that Rita had prepared, the first genuine smile he had seen on her face in weeks. He decided to accompany them in their study activities after the snack, something he usually delegated to Mrs. Judith. He sat at the large table in the library where the girls did their homework and observed how they worked. Isabella, methodical, solved the math exercises with precision, while Lucy wrote something in a purple-covered notebook that he had never seen before. "What are you writing, Lucy?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The girl quickly closed the notebook, blushing. "Just a story, Dad, for Portuguese class." "May I see it?" Lucy hesitated, looking at her sister as if seeking support. Isabella intervened. "It's to present next week, Dad. She hasn't finished it yet." Edward felt strangely excluded, as if his daughters shared a secret of which he was not a part. He decided not to insist, but made a mental note to check that notebook later. Dinner was served at 7 o'clock sharp. Mrs. Sarah joined them, now wearing a simple set of lavender pants and blouse. There was something different in the atmosphere of the dining room, an almost imperceptible lightness, as if a window had been opened in a long, closed room. "Isabella told me about your interest in ancient civilizations," commented Edward, trying to establish a connection with his daughter. The girl seemed surprised for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, we're studying Egypt now. It's fascinating how they built the pyramids without the technology we have today." "Your mother was in Egypt, did you know?" The words came out of Mrs. Sarah's mouth so naturally that for a moment no one reacted. Edward felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. The name of Anna, or any reference to her, had not been mentioned in that house for almost 3 years. It was an unwritten rule. but absolutely understood by everyone. The twins looked at the housekeeper with wide eyes, then at their father, waiting for his reaction. Edward's face hardened, his fingers tightening on his napkin. "Girls, finish dinner and go to your room. It's time for your bath." Without questioning, Isabella and Lucy rose simultaneously, took their plates to the kitchen as they were taught to do, and went upstairs in silence. Edward waited until he heard the bedroom door close before turning to Mrs. Sarah. "In my house, madam, we follow certain rules," he said in a controlled but icy voice. "One of them is not to mention the past. The girls don't need memories that might disturb them." Mrs. Sarah looked at him with a tranquility that bordered on insolence. There was no fear or embarrassment in her eyes, only a serene understanding that irritated him even more. "Do you really think not talking about their mother protects them, Mr. Baker? Or does it protect yourself?" Edward rose abruptly, his knuckles white with tension. "You are here to take care of the house and follow my guidance regarding the girls' routine, not to give opinions on how I raise my daughters." Mrs. Sarah also stood up, but with calm movements, as if she had all the time in the world. "I understand your concern, sir, and I will respect your rules. But allow me to say something. Those girls don't have the wounded hearts you imagine. They have already made peace with what happened. The one still at war is you yourself." Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Never since the incident had anyone dared to speak to him with such frankness about his feelings. Not even his partner and longtime friend Richard, who had been by his side in the most difficult moments, had ever suggested that Edward wasn't handling the situation well. "You know nothing about me or my family," he finally replied, his voice almost a whisper. "I suggest you limit yourself to your functions, or I'll have to find someone else for the position." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left the room, heading to his office, the refuge where no one, not even his daughters, dared to enter without being invited. He closed the door and sat in the leather armchair, feeling his accelerated breathing and a slight tremor in his hands. Why had those simple words affected him so much? He was in control. He had always been. Since the day he received the news about Anna, he hadn't allowed pain to dominate him. He had channeled all his energy into maintaining structure, routine, normalcy. The girls needed stability, not uncontrolled emotions. He picked up a picture frame that he kept face down in the desk drawer. It was the only photo of Anna that hadn't been stored in the attic boxes. In it, his wife smiled at the camera, her brown hair blowing in the wind, the same almond-shaped eyes that the girls had inherited shining with happiness. The photo had been taken at Cannon Beach during a rare weekend of rest before the twins were born. Anna had always been his opposite, spontaneous, emotional, full of life. While he planned each step carefully, she preferred improvisation. While he followed rigid schedules, she lost herself in books and conversations. Somehow they had complemented each other perfectly, until fate separated them. Edward closed his eyes, fighting against the wave of memories that threatened to engulf him. He couldn't afford the luxury of weakness. Not now. The girls depended on him. He put the photo back in the drawer and took a deep breath, regaining control. Tomorrow he would speak to Mrs. Sarah again. He would make it clear that despite her apparent good intention, certain lines could not be crossed. The routine had to be maintained. The past needed to remain where it was, buried under carefully constructed layers of silence. But a small voice in his mind, which sounded strangely similar to Anna's, whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to let a little light into that house of shadows. The next morning began like all others in the Baker household, punctual, organized, predictable. Edward woke up at 6, checked the girls' rooms at 6:15, and at 6:45 everyone was at the table for breakfast. The only difference was the presence of Mrs. Sarah, who appeared in the kitchen wearing a floral apron over her simple dress, a piece too colorful for the standards of that house where neutral tones predominated. "Good morning, Baker family," she greeted them with an energy that contrasted with the usual silence of the mornings. "I hope you slept well." Edward limited himself to a brief nod, still uncomfortable after the confrontation of the previous night. The girls, however, responded with a good morning that sounded less automatic than usual. "I helped Rita with breakfast," continued Mrs. Sarah, placing on the table a dish that wasn't part of the planned menu. "These are cornbread rolls with fennel, a recipe from my grandmother." Edward frowned, displeased with the alteration in the food routine. The girls' diet was carefully balanced, with specific portions and ingredients. "The girls follow a nutritional plan," he commented dryly. "We don't usually include sweets at breakfast." "Oh, but this isn't really a sweet, Mr. Baker," replied Mrs. Sarah with a serene smile. "It's cornbread with a touch of fennel. Very nutritious and with a low glycemic index. My grandmother lived to be 98 eating this every morning." Before Edward could protest, Lucy had already taken a roll and bitten into it, her eyes lighting up with the flavor. Isabella, always more cautious, looked at her father as if asking for permission. "Just for today," Edward conceded, checking his watch. There was no time for discussions if they wanted to keep the schedule. The rest of breakfast proceeded without incident, although Edward noticed small changes in the atmosphere. The girls seemed more alert, their movements less mechanical. When Lucy accidentally spilled a little juice on her napkin, instead of becoming visibly tense, as usually happened with any mistake, she simply took another napkin and cleaned the table naturally. At 7:15, Mercedes arrived to take the girls to school. Edward accompanied them to the door, as he always did, but this time, to his surprise, Lucy turned and hugged him quickly before leaving. It was such an unexpected gesture that he was paralyzed, not knowing how to react. When he finally raised his hand to touch his daughter's hair, she had already moved away and entered the car. "Have a good day, Dad," said Isabella, formally, but with a look that seemed to contain an unasked question. Edward went back inside feeling strangely disoriented. Lucy's hug, something so simple, so natural between father and daughter, had destabilized his carefully constructed emotional balance. He couldn't remember the last time he had hugged his daughters, certainly not after the incident. He found Mrs. Sarah in the kitchen, helping Rita organize the breakfast dishes. The two were talking in low voices, occasionally laughing like old friends, although they had met only the day before. "Mrs. Oliveira," he called, resuming his posture of authority. "I'd like to speak with you in my office, please." Mrs. Sarah dried her hands on her apron and followed him down the hallway, her small but determined steps marking their own rhythm in the house, where everything seemed timed. In the office, Edward indicated a chair for her and sat behind his imposing mahogany desk. The morning light entered through the large windows, illuminating shelves filled with books on law, engineering, and administration, the personal library of a man who valued practical knowledge above all. "Mrs. Oliveira," he began, carefully choosing his words, "I appreciate your willingness to help, but I must insist that you follow the established routines for this house. The girls need consistency and predictability." Mrs. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on his with a disconcerting intensity. "I understand, Mr. Baker. Consistency is important for children. But allow me to ask, have you ever wondered if the type of consistency you offer is what they really need?" Edward felt again that sensation of discomfort that her presence provoked, as if she could see through the facade of control that he had so meticulously built. "What do you mean by that?" "Children need routines, yes, but they also need space to be children, to feel, to experiment, even to make mistakes. You've created such a controlled environment that sometimes I wonder if they can breathe." Her frankness left him momentarily speechless. Part of him wanted to end that conversation immediately, perhaps even dismiss her services. But another part, a part he rarely acknowledged, was curious about what else she had to say. "You seem to have formed many opinions in just one day in my house," he finally replied, his voice more defensive than he intended. Mrs. Sarah smiled, a gentle smile that didn't match the seriousness of the conversation. "I have eyes trained by decades of experience, Mr. Baker. I see what many don't see." "And what exactly do you see here?" "I see a man trying to protect his daughters in the only way he knows how. I see two girls who love their father but who are hungry for something that isn't served at timed meals. And I see a house that, despite all its beauty and order, seems to have forgotten how to smile." Edward felt as if something broke inside him, a small crack in the wall he had built around his emotions. But he quickly composed himself, raising his head with renewed determination. "I appreciate your perspective, madam, but I insist that you follow the established routines. No alterations to the menu, schedules, or activities of the girls without my prior approval, and especially no comments about the past. Is that clear?" Mrs. Sarah rose slowly, smoothing her apron with hands wrinkled by time and work. "As you wish. I'll follow your rules as much as possible. There was something enigmatic in that last phrase, but Edward decided not to prolong the conversation. He had an important video conference in 20 minutes and needed to prepare. "Thank you. You can return to your activities now." When the door closed behind her, Edward allowed himself a moment of weakness. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, feeling a fatigue that wasn't physical, but which weighed on his shoulders like a lead cape. Why could this simple woman destabilize him so easily? Why did her words find cracks in the armor he had so carefully constructed? The rest of the morning proceeded without incident. Edward immersed himself in work, his safe refuge where each problem had a logical solution, where each decision could be based on numbers and facts, not on confusing and unpredictable emotions. When the girls returned from school, he was already back in control. They had lunch together, as always, with Mrs. Sarah serving the meal that Rita had prepared, following the planned menu, without alterations or surprises this time. "How was school today?" asked Edward, following the usual script. "Good," replied Isabella. "We received the math test scores. I got an A." "I got a B+, added Lucy, "but the teacher said my essay about the book we read was the best in the class." Edward nodded, satisfied with his daughter's performance. "Excellent. I want to see that essay later, Lucy." The girl seemed momentarily surprised, then smiled shyly. "Of course, Dad. It's in my backpack." It was a small moment, almost insignificant, but Edward felt something subtly change between them. The interest in his daughter's essay wasn't part of the routine. It was a minimal deviation, but a deviation nonetheless. In the afternoon, while the girls had ballet class in the adapted studio on the 3rd floor of the mansion, Edward worked in his office. Occasionally, he found himself listening to the music coming from above, Tchaikovsky, a piece from Swan Lake, and visualizing his daughters in their leotards and ballet slippers, executing the movements with the precision he had taught them to value in everything they did. Anna had insisted on the ballet classes, so they learned that not everything in life needs to be useful, she had said. Some things can be simply beautiful. At the time, he had agreed only to please her. Now it was one of the few traditions of hers that he had maintained. Around 5 o'clock, when he finished an important call with a client, Edward noticed something unusual. The house was too quiet. He couldn't hear the sound of the piano that Isabella should be practicing at that time, nor the noise of footsteps or voices. Intrigued and slightly worried, he left his office to investigate. He went down the hallway, passing through the empty living room, the dining room where the table was already being prepared for dinner, and finally reached the back door that led to the garden. It was there that he found them. Isabella, Lucy, and Mrs. Sarah were in the garden, crouched around a flower bed. The girls were wearing gardening gloves too small for their hands, probably unearthed from some forgotten cabinet. Mrs. Sarah, with her hands directly in the soil, was showing them how to plant what appeared to be flower seedlings. The scene was so unexpected, so out of the established routine, that Edward was paralyzed for a moment, just observing. There was something in the image of his daughters with their hands in the soil, the knees of their pants slightly dirty, their animated faces, while Mrs. Sarah explained something about the plants that instantly transported him to another time, when Anna used to spend hours in the garden with the still small girls, teaching them the names of flowers and telling stories about fairies that lived among the roots of the trees. It was Lucy who noticed him first. Seeing him at the door, her face lit up with a spontaneous smile. "Dad, come see what we're planting. They're violets, Mom's favorite flowers." Anna's name, said so naturally by Lucy, fell like a stone in the tranquil lake that Edward tried to maintain. The ripples spread instantly, disturbing the surface, revealing the depths. "You should be practicing piano," was all he managed to say, his voice hoarser than he intended. "Oh, it was my fault, Mr. Baker," intervened Mrs. Sarah, rising with an agile movement for someone her age. "The day was so beautiful that I thought a little fresh air would do the girls good. They practiced ballet for 2 hours straight, you know, and I promised they would make up for the piano after dinner." Edward felt torn between irritation at the break in routine and something more complex that he couldn't name as he saw his daughters so visibly happy, so similar to their mother at that moment. 20 minutes, he finally conceded. "Then I want you both washed and ready for dinner, and the piano will be practiced according to schedule." "Yes, sir," replied Mrs. Sarah with a smile that bordered on mischief, as if the two shared a secret. As he went back inside, Edward felt strangely light, as if he had left something heavy behind in the garden. Perhaps it was just the concerns of work, or perhaps it was something deeper, something he had carried for so long that it had become part of him, so familiar that he hardly noticed its weight. That night, for the first time in a long time, dinner at the Baker house was not consumed in silence. The girls talked about the violets, about the ballet class, about the books they were reading in school. Edward listened more than he spoke, but occasionally asked a question or made a comment. Mrs. Sarah observed everything with that same enigmatic smile, as if watching a spectacle whose ending she already knew. And when Edward retired to his room later, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He stood at the window, observing the stars that dotted the Portland sky, and allowed himself to remember, not with the sharp pain of before, but with an almost sweet longing, like the distant perfume of a familiar garden. The following days brought subtle changes to the routine of the Baker household. Nothing drastic enough for Edward to openly protest, but small alterations that, added together, began to transform the atmosphere of the mansion. Meals now included conversations. The piano was sometimes practiced with the window open, letting the music escape into the garden. The girls spent a few minutes each day tending to the violets they had planted, and Mrs. Sarah somehow orchestrated all of this without seeming to directly challenge Edward's authority. It was a particularly sunny Tuesday, when Edward decided to work from home to oversee a technical inspection of the mansion's electrical system. He was in his office, discussing some details of the report with the responsible engineer, when he heard a shout of joy coming from upstairs, something so unusual in that house that both men interrupted their conversation. "Excuse me," said Edward, rising. "We'll continue in a moment." He quickly climbed the stairs, following the sound of animated voices to the girls' room. The door was ajar, and through the gap he saw a scene that left him momentarily speechless. Lucy was sitting on the floor, hugging something to her chest, her face illuminated by a radiant smile. Isabella was kneeling beside her, equally excited. Mrs. Sarah observed the two with a serene look, as if watching the realization of something long awaited. "What's going on here?" asked Edward, pushing the door to enter. The three turned to him, startled. It was Lucy who answered first, raising the object she was holding as if it were a precious treasure. "Dad! We found Celeste! Mrs. Sarah found her!" Edward felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized the object in his daughter's hands, a cloth doll with blue wool hair, a dress printed with small stars, and a pointed Good Witch's hat. Celeste had been Lucy's favorite doll since she was 3 years old. Anna had bought it during a trip to Salem from a local artisan who created dolls inspired by American folklore. Lucy wouldn't sleep without Celeste by her side. Until the incident. After Anna's departure, the doll had mysteriously disappeared. Edward had looked for it everywhere, concerned about his daughter's attachment to the object, but never found it. Lucy had cried for nights on end, inconsolable until gradually she stopped mentioning Celeste. Edward had interpreted this as a sign that his daughter was overcoming the loss, both of the doll and of her mother. And now, almost 3 years later, there was Celeste apparently intact in Lucy's hands again. "Where did you find this?" he asked Mrs. Sarah, his voice betraying a mixture of emotions that he himself couldn't decipher. The housekeeper smiled, that enigmatic smile that seemed to say much more than her words. "I was doing a deep cleaning in the attic, as you authorized. I found a box with some old toys of the girls. This doll was there, along with some other objects." Edward frowned. He had never authorized a cleaning of the attic. In fact, the attic was practically the only place in the house that had remained untouched since the incident. It was there that he had stored all of Anna's things, her clothes, her books, her photographs, her memories. "I don't recall giving that authorization," he said, his voice firmer now. "Oh, it must have been a misunderstanding," replied Mrs. Sarah with tranquility. "I mentioned to Rita about doing a general cleaning of the house before winter, and she mentioned that the attic needed attention. I assumed it would be acceptable. If I erred, I apologize." There was something in the explanation that didn't sound completely true, but Edward couldn't confront her directly in front of the girls, especially with Lucy hugging the doll as if she feared someone would take it from her again. "We can talk about this later," he finally said. Then, addressing his daughters, "I have a meeting to finish. Continue with your activities, but remember that at 4 o'clock you have math tutoring." He turned to leave, but Isabella's voice stopped him. "Dad, Can I ask something? Edward looked at his older daughter, by only 7 minutes, as she always made a point of reminding everyone. Isabella observed him with a serious expression that made her seem much older than her 9 years. Of course, Isabella. In the attic, are there more of Mum's things? The question hit Edward like a bolt from the blue. The girls knew that their mother had departed, but they had never questioned where her belongings were. Or perhaps they had, but not to him. Yes, he replied after a brief silence. I stored her things up there. Could we see them someday? Edward felt his heart race. The attic was his last stronghold, the place where he kept the past boxed up, controlled. The idea of opening it, of exposing the girls to all those memories. We'll see, he replied vaguely, and left the room before his daughters could insist. He returned to the meeting with the engineer, but his mind was distant. How had Mrs. Sarah found exactly that doll? Of all the things stored in the attic, why precisely Celeste? And how did she know of the importance of that object to Lucy? Later, when he finally managed a moment alone with the housekeeper, he confronted her directly. Mrs. Oliveira, I need answers. How did you know about the doll? And why did you go to the attic without my explicit authorization? They were in the library, where Mrs. Sarah was organizing some books. She didn't seem surprised or intimidated by the questioning. Mr. Baker, I've worked with families for more than 4 decades. I've learned to observe, to listen to what isn't said. Lucy draws dolls with blue hair in her notebooks. She murmurs the name Celeste while sleeping. It wasn't difficult to deduce that it was an important object for her. And the attic. How did you know where to look? Mrs. Sarah placed a book on the shelf before responding, her movements deliberately slow, as if carefully choosing her words. In houses like this, where the past is kept away from sight, the attic is always the first place to look. As for authorization, I apologize if I exceeded my limits, but I don't regret it. Seeing the joy on Lucy's face today was worth any reprimand. Edward felt again that unsettling sensation that Mrs. Sarah knew much more than she should, that she saw through the carefully constructed walls of his emotional fortress. I don't want you to enter the attic again without my permission, and in the future, any object you find related to the past should be shown to me first. As you wish, sir, she replied, but her tone suggested that she complied with the order only out of courtesy, not because she agreed with it. The following days brought more inexplicable discoveries. A photo album of the trip that Edward and Anna had taken to Europe before the girls were born mysteriously appeared in the living room. An old CD of classical music, Anna's favorite collection, was found by Isabella on the shelf in her room. And most surprising, Anna's handwritten recipe diary was now in the kitchen, being consulted by Rita to prepare a chocolate cake that the girls mentioned missing. Each new object seemed to bring a different memory to the surface, a facet of their mother that the twins were rediscovering, or perhaps knowing for the first time since they were so young when they lost her. Edward observed this process with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. Part of him feared that the resurrected memories would cause more pain to his daughters, but another part, one he rarely acknowledged, felt a strange relief at seeing Anna gradually returning to life in the house, in conversations, in the little things. One Saturday morning, while the girls studied in the library as the routine dictated, Edward decided to do something he had been postponing: go up to the attic to check exactly what had been disturbed. He hadn't done so since he stored Anna's last things there, weeks after the incident. The attic was spacious and well organized, like the rest of the house. Large cardboard boxes, all labeled with Edward's precise handwriting, occupied one side of the space. On the other side, larger objects, an old crib, the girls' first toy piano, a rocking chair where Anna used to nurse them, were covered with white sheets, like ghosts of a past life. Edward went to the boxes, checking the labels. AP clothes, AP books, photographs, personal items. Some appeared to have been opened recently, the adhesive tape seals cut and then closed in a different way. In one of them, labeled Girls, Toys, Babies, the contents seemed to have been reorganized. While inspecting a particularly large box, his gaze caught something unusual. A small carved wooden chest that he didn't remember storing there. It was a beautiful piece, with floral motifs sculpted on the lid and a small worked metal clasp. Intrigued, he picked up the chest and tried to open it, but it was locked. Looking for this. Mrs. Sarah's voice behind him, almost made him drop the chest. Edward turned startled to find the housekeeper standing at the attic door, holding a small metal key. How did you get here without me hearing you?" "Years of practice in not disturbing the silence of the houses where I work," she replied with a slight smile. "And as for the key, it was with the girls. Apparently their mother entrusted it to Isabella before departing." Edward looked from the key to the chest, confused. "That's not possible. I've never seen this chest before, and Anna didn't have time to—" His voice failed. The accident that took Anna from them had been sudden, unexpected. There were no goodbyes, no expressed last wishes, no time to entrust mysterious keys to her daughters. Mrs. Sarah approached slowly and extended the key. "Sometimes, Mr. Baker, people prepare for departures they don't even expect themselves, as if a part of them knew what was coming." Edward took the key with trembling fingers. It fit perfectly into the chest's lock. With a soft click, the clasp opened. Inside, carefully folded, were several letters, each in an envelope with a name and a date. There were envelopes addressed to Isabella, to Lucy, and several with Edward's name. The dates varied, some for future birthdays of the girls, others without a specific occasion, just with the instruction, "Open when you need to." And on top of the letters, a note written in Anna's unmistakable handwriting, "For when I am no longer here to say it in person, because some things need to be said, even if through paper and time." Edward felt the world spin around him. How was this possible? How had he never known of the existence of that chest, those letters? "I found the chest 3 days ago," explained Mrs. Sarah, as if reading his thoughts. "It was hidden behind that rocking chair. When I asked the girls about the key, Isabella remembered that her mother had given her a treasure to keep shortly before departing. She kept it hidden all this time, waiting for the right moment." "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" asked Edward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Because some discoveries need to be made by the right person at the right time. And this is your time, Mr. Baker." Edward looked at the letters, at the dates written on some of the envelopes. There was one addressed to him with the inscription, "For when the walls become too high." With trembling hands, he took the envelope and opened it. Anna's handwriting, so familiar and at the same time so painfully absent from his life, covered the page with that unique mixture of elegance and enthusiasm that had always characterized everything she did. "My dear Edward," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it's because the walls that I always feared you would build around yourself have finally become so high that you can no longer see over them. I know your heart, my love. I know that your first reaction to pain is to control it, organize it, lock it in safe compartments. That's how you've dealt with the world since I've known you. But you can't organize love in boxes, Edward. It overflows, escapes, finds cracks, just as you can't protect our daughters from life by hiding it from them." Edward couldn't continue reading. The tears, held back for so long, finally found their way, blurring his vision. He carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. "How did you know?" he asked Mrs. Sarah without raising his eyes. "How did you know the chest was here? That the letters existed? That Isabella had the key?" Mrs. Sarah lightly touched his shoulder, the first physical contact between them since she had arrived at the house. "There are things one knows without knowing how one knows, Mr. Baker. Now, perhaps it's time to take this chest downstairs. Your daughters have been waiting a long time to know the mother they lost, and perhaps the father is also ready to rediscover the wife he has been trying to forget." Edward stood up, the chest firmly secured in his arms, like a precious treasure newly discovered. When he turned to thank Mrs. Sarah, the attic door was empty. Only the distant sound of footsteps descending the stairs indicated that she had been there. Taking a deep breath, Edward followed the same path, carrying with him not only the chest of memories, but also the weight of 3 years of silence that was finally beginning to break. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The chest of letters transformed the atmosphere of the Baker house in a way that even the previous small changes hadn't managed. Edward came down from the attic, like a man carrying not just an object, but a revelation. He found his daughters in the library, still bent over their study books, and for the first time in years, he interrupted the established routine. "Girls," he called from the door, his voice betraying an emotion that the twins rarely heard. "Come with me to the living room. There's something we need to see together." Isabella and Lucy exchanged surprised looks, but followed their father without questioning. In the living room, Edward placed the chest on the coffee table and sat on the sofa, inviting his daughters to sit beside him, another unusual gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the girls. "This chest contains letters from your mother," he explained, observing his daughter's eyes widen in understanding. "Letters that she wrote to us before departing. Isabella, do you remember the key she gave you?" The girl nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the carved chest. "I kept it as she asked," she replied in a low voice. "She said it was a treasure for when we needed it, but that I would know when the right time came. When Celeste appeared and then the photo, I remembered the key." Edward felt a lump in his throat. While he had been trying to erase all memories of Anna, his daughters had kept them alive, hidden like small seeds waiting for the right season to sprout. "Some letters have specific dates," he continued, opening the chest. "Birthdays, graduations, important moments that will come in the future. Others are for emotional moments. I think we can open one of those now." Edward removed an envelope addressed to both girls with the inscription, "For when you miss me." Lucy's hands trembled slightly when she took it. Isabella, always the more restrained, kept her gaze fixed on the envelope, while her sister carefully opened it. Lucy unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. "My little stars, Isabella and Lucy. If you are reading this letter, it's because you miss me, and that means that somehow I am no longer with you as I would like to be. First, I want you to know that wherever I am, my love for you hasn't changed one bit. A mother's love doesn't end, doesn't diminish, doesn't get lost. It just changes form." Lucy's voice faltered. Isabella, noticing her sister's difficulty, took the letter and continued reading. "I know it's hard to understand why some people need to leave earlier than we would like. I myself don't fully understand, but I believe that the love we shared remains, like a light that never goes out even when we can't see its source. When you miss me, look at the stars. Choose one, the brightest, and imagine that I'm sending my love through it. Look at each other and see that I left a little piece of myself in each of you, in Isabella's eyes so observant and deep, in Lucy's smile, which always lights up the room, in the courage of both, in the kindness, in the intelligence. And look at your father. He may seem as strong as a rock, but rocks also feel the rain and the wind. He will need your love as much as you need his, perhaps even more. Keep a secret for me? Your father, behind all that seriousness, has the kindest heart I've ever known. He just forgets that sometimes. Remind him, will you?" "Will. I would have given everything to see you grow up, to be present in every important moment, and also in the ordinary moments, those that seem small but which, in the end, are the ones that matter most. Since I can't be physically present, I leave these letters. Pieces of my heart on paper. Live fully, my little ones. Feel everything. Joy, sadness, anger, love. Don't be afraid of your feelings. They are what make us human, what connect us to each other. And when you look at the violets in the garden, I hope we still have violets in the garden, remember that I planted them thinking of you, fragile but resilient flowers which return each spring, no matter how hard the winter has been, with all the love that exists in the universe, Mom." When Isabella finished reading, the silence that fell over the room was not the cold, calculated silence that usually inhabited the Baker house. It was a living, pulsating silence, full of emotions that had been contained for so long. Edward looked at his daughters and saw silent tears streaming down Lucy's cheeks. Isabella, always more restrained, kept her lips tightly pressed together, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. Without thinking, he extended his arms and, for the first time in years, hugged his daughters. The contact broke the last barrier. Lucy sobbed openly, burying her face in her father's chest. Isabella, after a moment of hesitation, also allowed herself to cry, her small shoulders trembling with the force of long-repressed emotions. "I miss her, Dad," whispered Lucy between sobs. "Every day." "I do too, my little one," replied Edward, his own voice choked with emotion. "Every day." It was the most honest moment they had shared since the incident. No words of false comfort, no promise that the pain would pass, No attempt to minimize what they felt, just the joint acknowledgement of an absence that had marked them deeply. Not far away at the living room door, Mrs. Sarah observed the scene with tears in her eyes and a serene smile on her lips. Silently, she withdrew to the kitchen where Rita was preparing dinner. "Did it work?" asked the cook in a low voice. "It's just beginning," replied Mrs. Sarah. "But yes, the ice has started to melt." That night, for the first time since the incident, Anna's name was openly pronounced at the dinner table. The girls, encouraged by the letter and their father's new openness, began to ask questions about their mother. Small things at first. What was her favorite color, violet like the flowers? What music she liked to listen to, Bach for thinking, Simon and Garfunkel for dreaming. What her laugh was like. Edward answered each question honestly, discovering in the process that talking about Anna didn't increase the pain as he had always feared. On the contrary, it was as if each shared memory made her presence more real and, paradoxically, made her absence more bearable. When the girls went to bed, Edward accompanied them to their room, another deviation from the routine. He helped Lucy settle Celeste in bed, and after a moment of hesitation, sat on the edge of the mattress. Can I tell you a story?" The twins exchanged surprised looks. Bedtime stories were a distant memory, something their mother did, not their father. "Please," asked Lucy, her eyes shining with expectation. Edward took a deep breath and began. Once upon a time, in a city not very different from Portland, a very serious young lawyer and a librarian who believed that all the world's problems could be solved with the right book. The story of the meeting between Edward and Anna, told with simple but emotion-laden words, filled the girls' room with a new light. They listened attentively, absorbing every detail, reconstructing in their minds the image of the mother they barely remembered. When he finished the story and the girls were almost asleep, Edward leaned down and hesitantly kissed the forehead of each one, another forgotten gesture that now returned, timid but sincere. "Dad?" called Isabella when he was already at the door. "Can we read another letter tomorrow?" Edward felt a tightness in his chest, not of pain but of a strange mixture of longing and hope. "Yes, we can," he replied. "Good night, my little ones." "Good night, Dad," they responded in unison, their voices sleepy but content. Back in his library, Edward sat at his desk with the chest of letters. There were several envelopes addressed to him, each with a different inscription. His fingers passed over several until they stopped on one that said, "For when the silence becomes deafening." With slightly trembling hands, he opened the envelope and began to read. "My dear Edward, if you are reading this letter, it's because the silence in our house, your house now, has become too heavy to bear. I know this silence well. It's the same that settled in when you lost your parents in the accident, when you were only 17. It's the silence you cultivate when the pain is too great to be expressed in words. But let me tell you a secret, love. Silence doesn't heal. It only numbs the pain, which continues there, growing in the shadows, feeding on all the unspoken words, all the unexpressed feelings. Remember how we met? You came to the library looking for a constitutional law book, and I insisted that you also take a book of poetry. You resisted, of course. "I don't have time for poetry," you said, so serious with your 25 years and your impeccable ties. But you ended up taking the Pablo Neruda that I chose for you. A week later, you returned with the book memorized and recited Sonnet 17 to me by heart. That's when I knew there was much more to you than that controlled facade allowed anyone to see. The man who recited poetry to me that day, who later surprised me with an improvised picnic at the Japanese gardens when he learned I had never been there, who openly cried when our daughters were born. That man is still there inside you, Edward. He hasn't disappeared, he is just hidden behind the wall you built to protect yourself from pain. Our daughters need that man. They need the father who knows how to laugh, who tells stories, who allows the house to fill with music and color and, yes, even a little mess from time to time. They don't need perfection, Edward. They need love, imperfect, messy, sometimes awkward, but real. And you, my love, need to allow yourself to feel again, the whole range of emotions, not just those that are safe and controllable. The pain of my departure, yes, but also the joy of the memories we shared, the satisfaction of seeing our daughters grow, the pride in their achievements, big and small. I know it's easier to write this than to live it. I know that for you, control has always been synonymous with safety. But some of the best things in life happen precisely when we lose control a little. Our love was like that, remember? Neither of us planned it. It simply happened, defying your meticulously organized schedule, and my promise to myself never to fall in love with a man in a suit. Allow life to enter our house again, Edward. Open the windows. Let the girls run in the garden. Play that piano you abandoned. Dine out of schedule sometimes. Tell stories about me. The funny ones, the tender ones, even those in which we fervently disagreed. And please, allow yourself to cry. Tears are not a sign of weakness, as your father taught you. They are just the form that love finds to continue flowing when words are not enough. Always yours even after everything, Anna. Edward let the letter fall on the desk, unable to contain the tears that now flowed freely down his face. It was as if Anna were there in the room with him, seeing through all the defenses he had built, knowing him better than he knew himself. At that moment, he realized how much time and energy he had dedicated to maintaining control, to avoiding pain, to protecting himself and his daughters from emotions he considered dangerous. And the result had been a silent house, where life happened in carefully organized compartments, with no room for the unexpected, for spontaneous joy, for true growth. She always knew, didn't she? Mrs. Sarah's voice surprised him. He hadn't heard her enter the library. The housekeeper stood near the door, a cup of tea in her hands that she now offered to him. "Knew what?" asked Edward, accepting the cup gratefully. "How you would react if she left. How you would build walls around your heart. How you would try to protect the girls by distancing them from any memory that might cause pain." Edward looked at the woman with new eyes. There was something in the way she spoke of Anna, as if she had known her deeply. "You knew my wife before coming to work here, didn't you? It wasn't just a coincidence that you replaced Mrs. Judith." Mrs. Sarah smiled, that enigmatic smile that seemed to carry ancient secrets. "Let's say that Anna and I had our paths cross a long time ago, and that promises were made, promises that I am fulfilling now." Before Edward could question further, she continued, "What's important is not how I got here, Mr. Baker. What's important is what's happening now." Spring finally arriving at this house after a long winter? Edward nodded slowly, understanding that there was much more to Mrs. Sarah's presence than he could understand at the moment. But of one thing he was certain. Her arrival had been the catalyst for changes that, although painful, were necessary and deep down liberating. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Mrs. Sarah just smiled again and headed for the door. "Sleep well, Mr. Baker. Tomorrow will be a new day, and there are more letters to be read, more stories to be told, more life to be lived." When he was alone again, Edward picked up Anna's letter and reread it, letting each word penetrate his heart. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the grand piano in the music room, removed the protective cover and sat on the bench. His fingers touched the keys hesitantly at first, then with more confidence. The melody of Debussy's Clair de Lune, Anna's favorite, filled the house, crossing doors and walls, climbing stairs, finding its way to the girls' room, where Isabella and Lucy awakened slightly, smiled in the dark, and went back to sleep, lulled by the music that somehow seemed to bring back a little of the mother they had lost. And in the garden, under Portland's starry sky, the newly planted violets seemed more vibrant, as if responding to the music and emotions that now flowed freely through the Baker house. The week that followed the discovery of the chest of letters marked a profound transformation in the Baker house. It was as if the very air had changed, becoming lighter, more alive. The curtains, previously always drawn to keep the light controlled, now remained open during the day, allowing the autumn sun to illuminate the rooms with its golden glow. Music returned to being part of the routine, not just the piano mechanically practiced by the girls, but old records playing during meals, Edward playing the piano in the evenings, and even Rita humming in the kitchen without worrying about being appropriately discreet. The routine, once rigid as armor, became more flexible. Schedules continued to be respected, but with room for small deviations, for unplanned moments of conversation or shared reading. Meals became spaces for exchange, not just for nutrition. And most importantly, Anna's name once again echoed through the corridors, in the stories that Edward now shared with his daughters, in the memories that the twins tried to reconstruct, in the small traditions that were being resurrected. Edward had taken a week off from work, something unthinkable until then, to dedicate himself to organizing Anna's letters, and reintroducing her memory into their daughters' lives in a careful and loving way, no longer avoiding the pain, but facing it together as a family. That Saturday morning, as they had breakfast on the terrace, another habit recovered from the past, Edward observed his daughters with new eyes. Isabella, always so serious and controlled like himself, now allowed herself occasional spontaneous smiles. Lucy, naturally more emotional, seemed to have recovered an inner light that had been dimmed by years of restraint. "What are we doing today, Dad?" asked Lucy, nibbling on a piece of toast with strawberry jam, an item that had recently returned to the house's menu after Edward found a letter from Anna specifically about the small indulgences that make life sweeter. "I thought we could visit the Japanese gardens," replied Edward. "It was your mother's favorite place in Portland." The girl's eyes lit up. The Japanese gardens were one of the city's landmarks, with its monumental beauty and meticulously maintained grounds, but Edward had avoided the place since the incident. It had been there that he and Anna had their first official date after that visit to the library where they met. "Can we have a picnic there?" asked Isabella, surprising her father with her enthusiasm. "Of course you can," intervened Mrs. Sarah, who was approaching with a pitcher of fresh juice. "Rita and I are already preparing a basket. Your mother loved picnics, didn't she, Mr. Baker?" Edward smiled, remembering Anna spreading a checkered blanket on the grass, insisting that sandwiches tasted better outdoors, even when it threatened to rain. Yes, she loved them. She said food was never just food. It was an experience, a memory in the making. "She seemed very wise," commented Lucy, her 9-year-old eyes suddenly mature. "She was," agreed Edward. "In her own way, not with academic knowledge like mine, but with a wisdom that came from life, from the books she read, from the people she observed." The girls absorbed each new piece of information about their mother like thirsty plants after a long drought. The desire to know her was so great that sometimes Edward wondered how he could have deprived them of this for so long, believing he was protecting them. After breakfast, the twins ran to get ready, a genuine childlike excitement replacing the automatic efficiency with which they normally performed tasks. Edward took the moment to talk with Mrs. Sarah, who was organizing the table with Rita's help. "Mrs. Oliveira," he began, still reluctant to call her by her first name, despite the intimacy that had developed between them. "I need to ask you a question I've been postponing." The housekeeper looked at him with that serene expression that always seemed to anticipate what he would say. "About how I knew Anna, I imagine," she replied, surprising him once again with her ability to read his thoughts. "Yes, in the letters she never specifically mentions you. However, you seem to know exactly where to find the chest, new details of Anna's life that even I didn't know, and there's something in the way you talk about her, as if you had known her deeply." Mrs. Sarah finished folding a napkin before responding, her movements deliberately slow, as if organizing not just the fabric, but also her thoughts. "I met Anna when she was just a girl," she finally began. "I worked as a housekeeper in her parents' home in Astoria, a small historic town not far from here. She was an extraordinary child. Curious, intelligent, with that same light in her eyes that I now see in Lucy." Edward nodded, absorbing the information. Anna had spoken little about her childhood, only that she had grown up in a small town on the Oregon coast, and that she had lost her parents early, being raised by an aunt. Years later, when she was already a young librarian in Portland, our paths crossed again. I no longer worked for the family, but we kept in touch. Anna was like that. She never forgot the important people in her life. "And then," pressed Edward, feeling there was more to that story. "Then she met you," smiled Mrs. Sarah. "And I saw how much she changed. There was an even more intense light in her when she talked about you, even when she complained about your obsession with schedules and your resistance to anything that couldn't be controlled or predicted." Edward couldn't help but smile. That was Anna, always teasing him about his methodical side, while at the same time respecting the security that characteristic brought to their lives. "When she got pregnant with the twins, she sought me out," continued Mrs. Sarah. "She said she had a presentiment, nothing concrete, just an intuition that perhaps she wouldn't be present to see the girls grow up. At the time, I thought it was just first-time jitters. All mothers have irrational fears during pregnancy, but Anna was different. She didn't fear for herself, she feared for the family that would remain if something happened to her. And that's when she wrote the letters," concluded Edward, the pieces finally fitting together. "Yes, Throughout her pregnancy and the first years of the girls, she wrote, not in a morbid or obsessive way, but like someone leaving a legacy of love, just in case. She asked me to keep some, to help her hide others. The chest was her idea. But how did you end up here now after so long? Mrs. Sarah exchanged a significant look with Rita, who was following the conversation in silence. Anna made me promise that if something happened to her, I would find a way to be present when the three of you were ready to receive me. I observed from afar during these years. I saw when the walls began to get too high, when silence became the official language of this house, and when I learned that Mrs. Judith would need to take leave. You arranged everything, completed Edward, finally understanding. Mrs. Judith never had heart problems, did she? Not exactly problems, just a routine checkup that I convinced her to turn into a small break. She's a good woman, Mr. Baker, but she followed your instructions to the letter. This house needed someone who knew when a rule needed to be broken. Edward should have felt manipulated, perhaps even betrayed, but all he could feel was a profound gratitude. Without Mrs. Sarah's intervention, how much longer would he have lived in that emotional prison he had created for himself and his daughters? "Thank you," he said simply, his voice choked with emotion, "for keeping your promise to Anna, for bringing life back to this house." Mrs. Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with contained tears. "It wasn't just for her that I came, Mr. Baker. It was for the three of you as well. Families shouldn't live in museums of unvisited memories. They should live in houses where the past is honored, but where the present is fully lived and the future is awaited with hope." Before Edward could respond, the twins came running back, already dressed for the outing, excited about the prospect of visiting their mother's special place. The Japanese gardens were particularly beautiful that autumn morning. The leaves in shades of red and gold contrasted with the evergreen of the conifers, and the mild temperature made the outing pleasant. The Baker family, father, daughters, and the housekeeper who had become much more than that, walked along the well-maintained paths, Edward pointing out Anna's favorite spots, telling stories about the dates they had there, the conversations, the dreams they shared. They found a quiet place near the koi pond to spread the picnic blanket. Rita had outdone herself in the preparation: cheese and turkey sandwiches, orange muffins, Anna's recipe rediscovered in her notebook, fresh fruits, natural juices, and even small chocolate bonbons, another indulgence returning to the Bakers' lives. As they ate, spontaneous laughter replaced the usual silence. Isabella, normally so composed, let herself fall back on the grass to observe the clouds, pointing out shapes she imagined seeing in them. Lucy, seated with Celeste by her side, drew in the small notebook she now carried everywhere, capturing in childish but expressive strokes the landscape around them. Edward observed his daughters, amazed at the transformation. It was as if he were truly seeing them for the first time in years, not as extensions of his own discipline and control, but as unique beings, with their own personalities, desires, and needs. Beings who carried part of Anna and part of him, but who were above all themselves. "She would be proud," said Mrs. Sarah, sitting beside him on the blanket, following his gaze to the girls. "Of the daughters?" "Of them, yes. But also of you, Mr. Baker, for finding the courage to tear down the walls, for allowing yourself to feel again, even knowing that would include pain." Edward nodded, understanding the depth of those simple words. The pain was still there. Anna's absence was an immutable fact in their lives, but it was no longer a suffocating presence that needed to be denied at all costs. It was a part of their story, intertwined with happy memories, with the love that persisted, with life that continued. "You know what struck me most about the letters?" he asked, contemplating Portland's blue sky. "The way she predicted exactly how I would react, how I would try to control the pain, organize the grief, protect the girls by isolating them from any memory that might cause suffering." "Anna knew you deeply," replied Mrs. Sarah, "perhaps better than you knew yourself." "Yes, and still, she loved me. Not despite my flaws, but with them included in the package. That's what true love does, Mr. Baker. It sees everything, the good, the bad, the complicated, and chooses to love anyway." The afternoon passed in a serenity that had long been absent from Edward's life. When they finally gathered their things to return home, he felt simultaneously exhausted and invigorated, as if he had completed a long physical and emotional journey. In the car, the girls fell asleep, the fatigue of play and emotions finally catching up with them. Edward drove in silence, occasionally looking in the rearview mirror at his daughter's sleeping faces. "They look so much like her," he commented softly to Mrs. Sarah, who was in the passenger seat. "Yes, they have her smile, but they have your strength, Mr. Baker, the ability to face whatever comes. It's a good combination." Back at the mansion, night fell gently on the Baker family. The girls, reinvigorated by a brief nap in the car, helped prepare a simple dinner. Edward opened a bottle of wine, another small pleasure he had denied himself for a long time. After dinner, they all gathered in the living room. The girls insisted on opening another letter from the chest. It had become a nightly ritual, each envelope revealing a new aspect of Anna, a new thread in the tapestry of memories they were reconstructing. "This one has an interesting inscription," said Edward, picking up an envelope addressed to the whole family. "For when the house smiles again." The girls settled on the sofa, one on each side of their father, while Mrs. Sarah sat discreetly in a nearby armchair. Edward carefully opened the envelope and began to read. "My loves, Edward, Isabella, and Lucy. If you are reading this letter, it's because something wonderful has happened. Our house, your house now, has once again become a true home, a place where laughter is allowed, where tears are not hidden, where memories can be shared without fear. I don't know how much time has passed since I left, perhaps years. Perhaps the girls are already teenagers, or perhaps they are still small. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you have found a way to move forward without forgetting me, to live fully while keeping my love as part of your lives. Edward, my love, I always knew you would be capable of this. Behind that facade of control and discipline, there has always existed a man with an immense heart, capable of loving deeply. Perhaps you needed a little push to remember that. If that was the case, I hope my friend Sarah managed to reach you. She promised she would find a way. Isabella, my little observer, with eyes that see everything and a heart that feels deeply even when it tries to hide. You are so much like your father in that respect. Always remember that feeling is not weakness. It's what makes us human. It's what connects us to each other. Lucy, my dreamer, with your limitless imagination and your heart always open. Never lose that ability to see beauty in everything, to create worlds with words and images. It's a precious gift that few possess. I'm not there physically to see you grow, to celebrate your achievements, to console you in difficult moments. But I want you to know that somehow that I don't completely understand, my love remains. Not as a ghostly presence or a weight to be carried, but as a light, sometimes soft, sometimes intense, but always present. Now, I have one last request to make. A request that I could only make when I knew you were ready, when the pain is no longer so acute, when love has found new ways to flow. I ask that you celebrate life. Mine, yes, with shared memories, with stories told and retold, with traditions maintained, but mainly yours, the life that continues, that renews itself each day, that brings new joys, new challenges, new opportunities to love. Make a toast to me once in a while. Plant violets in the garden in spring. Read the books I loved. Visit the places that were special to us. But above all, create new memories. Make room in your hearts for new joys, new loves, new possibilities. Edward, allow yourself to find happiness again. The girls will need a maternal figure as they grow, someone who can offer that special type of love and guidance that only a mother, biological or not, can give. I don't know if this has already happened, if there is a new woman in your life or if it is still to come. But know that you have my blessing. Loving again doesn't diminish what we had. It only proves how deep and transformative it was. Girls, be gentle with your father. He does the best he can even when he makes mistakes. And if one day there is another woman in your lives, give her a chance. Not as a replacement for me, but as someone who can bring her own type of love to the family. Above all, always remember, love never really ends. It just changes form. From physical presence to memory, from acute pain to sweet longing, from past to future. Live, love, laugh, cry. Be present in each moment. It's the only way to live that's worth it. With all my love today and always, Anna, Mom. When Edward finished reading, Silent tears were streaming down the faces of everyone in the room, but they were different tears from those they had shed before, not just of loss, but also of gratitude, of acceptance, of a deeper understanding of what it meant to love and be loved. Isabella was the first to speak, her voice small but determined. "Can we do that, Dad? Celebrate life as Mom asked?" Edward looked at his daughter, then at Lucy, and finally at Mrs. Sarah, whose gaze conveyed a silent strength, an unconditional support. "Yes, we can," he replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "In fact, we've already begun." That night, after the girls fell asleep, Edward returned to the library, where the chest of letters remained on the table. There were still many envelopes to be opened, some destined for specific moments in the future, like 15th birthdays, graduations, perhaps even weddings. Letters that would patiently wait for the right moment, keeping pieces of Anna's heart to be revealed when her daughters were ready to receive them. He found Mrs. Sarah on the porch, observing Portland's starry sky with a serene expression. "Did you know about all the letters? About what they contained?" he asked, joining her. "Not all," she replied. "Anna was a woman of many secrets, even to those close to her. But I knew the spirit of them, the love that drove them." Edward nodded, looking at the stars that dotted the autumn sky. "How long will you stay with us?" he asked, after a moment of comfortable silence. Mrs. Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the sparkle of the stars. "Until you no longer need me. Mrs. Judith will eventually return, when she's ready. And the three of you will also be ready, to move forward, to build a new life that honors the past without being a prisoner to it." "I think we've already begun that journey," reflected Edward. "Thanks to you." "No, Mr. Baker, thanks to Anna. I was just the instrument. She left the map for you to find your way back, to each other and each to himself." That night, when he finally retired, Edward did something he hadn't done in years. He placed a photograph of Anna on his bedside table, the same one he had kept hidden in his desk drawer. Not as a symbol of perpetual mourning, but as a beloved presence that could now be remembered with a smile, even if sometimes accompanied by a tear. The Baker house would continue to evolve in the months and years that followed. The routine would never again be as rigid as before, although organization and discipline, important values for Edward, would remain present. Laughter would become more frequent. Music would return to being a constant presence. The violets in the garden would bloom each spring, as a silent reminder of a promise kept. And, most importantly, Edward and his daughters would learn day by day that it was possible to honor those who were gone without ceasing to live fully in the present. That memories could be a comfort, not just a source of pain. That love, even transformed by physical absence, continued to flow, to grow, to sustain. Anna would forever remain an essential part of the Baker family, not as a ghost haunting silent corridors, but as a light illuminating the path ahead, guiding them with love through the joys and challenges that life still held in store. And on special nights, when the stars shone particularly bright over Portland, they would raise their glasses in a silent toast to the woman who, even in absence, had found a way to bring peace back to those she loved.